Basic Blueprint Reading for Welders. Chapter 9, Machined Features, Part 1. Gary Pace, P.E., CWI, TexasWeldingEngineering.com. Here's where I snagged all the information. Open Oregon Blueprint Reading. If you do a Google search on Open Oregon Blueprint Reading, this information should come up. There's a book online and it has everything. You're going to want to go to, I think, Chapter 9 or 10, and that's where the information is. All the answers are right there. So we're going to talk about bevel, boss, chamfer, counterbore, countersink, and dovetail. These are all words you might run across out in the industry, depending on where you're working and what you're working on. But these are good words to work into your vocabulary and have some idea of what the heck they're talking about. Okay, we've got a bevel. A bevel is a surface cut at an angle. In regard to welding, a bevel will normally end up being a surface prep for a weld. So if we cut an angle like this on something, it's a bevel. That's what we call a bevel. You're going to run into this all the time in the welding universe. How big a bevel do you want on that? Do you want the bevel to be 30 degrees or 50 degrees? What's the print say? What kind of bevel do we need on this? So this is a bevel. That's what a bevel looks like. Okay, so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about a bevel for welding. So you can see that we've taken what we have on the previous slide, we've cut a bevel on something, and that's what we're talking about. And this will come into play in groove welds or bevel groove welds. So there you've got the angle of the bevel. If you're gonna be a welder, you're gonna run across this term from now until hell freezes over. This is a boss. A circular pad on forgings or castings which project out from the body of the part. The surface of the boss is machined smooth for a bolt head to seat on it or has a hole drilled through to accommodate the bolt shank. So this is what's called a boss. A boss. You can see it's kind of raised up. We'll see these on forgings and castings. You could run across this out there in the real world. A chamfer, a process of cutting away a sharp external corner or edge, not for welding. So this is a chamfer. So that's what a chamfer looks like. So this is a counterbore. So if we needed to put a bolt into this hole, this would be a counterbore. So we'd already have a hole that's been drilled out, and then we would make the top part a little bigger so that bolt hole would sit down in it and be flush with the surface. So this is a counterbore. To enlarge a drilled hole to a given diameter and depth, usually done for recessing a bolt head. Counterbore. Okay, so this is what a counterbore, what a bolt would look like in a counterbore from a side view, from a cutaway view, section view. So here's what, here's we got an example of what the bolts might look like as they're sitting in here. So this is what it would look like with a counterbore. And you're probably wondering, why do I need to learn this stuff? I'm just here to weld, old man. I'm just here to weld. Well, welding intersects with a lot of other industries, and we got time on our hands where you guys aren't shop burning rods, so we're going to cover some other stuff that might be beneficial to you in the long run. This is a countersink. It's similar to a counterbore, but it's tapered. It's angled. It's not just a hole that's drilled in there at a 90 degrees. It's got a sloped surface. To machine a conical depression in a drilled hole for recessing flathead, screws, or bolts. So these are for flathead bolts or screws. This is a countersink. Here's what counterbore looks like versus countersink. So you can see them side by side. The countersunk hole is tapered, and the counterbore hole is just drilled perpendicular to the surface. So this is a countersunk hole versus a counterbored hole. Here's another example of countersunk versus counterbored. So this is in woodworking, which we don't really do, but it gives you a good idea of the difference between counterbore and countersinking a hole. This is a dovetail, a slot of any depth and width which has angled sides, a dovetail. This is what a dovetail looks like. A lot of times in machining, if you need to put two parts together, this is a dovetail. Okay, so we covered bevel, boss, chamfer, counterbore, countersink, and dovetail.